April 28, 1944. Staff Sergeant Charles Wilson felt the vibration of 4 Pratt & Whitney engines through his boots as the black-painted B-24 Liberator climbed into the moonless English night. The aircraft, serial number 42-40997, bore a peculiar name painted across its nose: the Worry Bird. At 23 years old, Wilson served as flight engineer aboard this machine, and on this night, he had every reason to worry. The aircraft carried no bombs. Its belly turret had been removed, replaced by a circular hole lined with smooth metal. Inside the fuselage, steel containers filled with weapons, radios and ammunition sat secured to modified bomb racks. Outside, not a single navigation light betrayed their position against the darkness. They were flying alone, unescorted, toward occupied France on a mission so classified that Wilson's own family would never know the true nature of his final flight. The Worry Bird represented something unprecedented in aerial warfare. This was not a bombing mission. This was not reconnaissance. This was something the military would classify as secret for over 50 years. Something that required painting aircraft glossy black to absorb searchlight beams. Something that demanded crews fly at altitudes so low they could count individual trees in the French countryside below. The aircraft belonged to the 801st Bombardment Group, though that designation itself served as a cover story. Ground crews at RAF Harrington were told these black bombers conducted pathfinding missions. Base administration received carefully crafted lies about their purpose. Even the air crews themselves operated on a need-to-know basis, receiving coordinates without destinations, carrying cargo without manifests, dropping supplies to people whose names they would never learn. The real mission had a code name that would eventually become synonymous with clandestine airborne operations: Operation Carpetbagger. The genesis of this secret air war began in October 1943, when Colonel Clifford Heflin and Major Bob Fish met with representatives from the Royal Air Force, US VIII Air Force Bomber Command, and a relatively new intelligence organization called the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS, predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency, faced a critical problem. Across Nazi-occupied Europe, resistance fighters desperately needed weapons, ammunition, communications equipment, and coordination with Allied forces. The British Special Operations Executive had been conducting supply missions, but the scope of coming operations, particularly the planned invasion of France, demanded exponentially greater capacity. The combined chiefs of staff determined that American heavy bombers would need to join this effort. But these missions required capabilities entirely foreign to the doctrine of daylight precision bombing that defined American air strategy. They required low-altitude night flying, pinpoint navigation without radio communication, and the ability to find unmarked landing zones in hostile territory using only moonlight and primitive electronic aids. The aircraft selected for this unprecedented mission was the consolidated B-24 Liberator, at the time the most produced American military aircraft in history. The B-24 possessed certain advantages that made it ideal for clandestine operations, despite its reputation as a difficult aircraft to fly. Its capacious fuselage could accommodate substantial cargo. Its range exceeded that of most contemporary bombers, critical for penetrating deep into occupied Europe. The high-mounted Davis wing, though it contributed to poor low-speed handling characteristics, provided efficient cruise performance for long-duration missions. Most importantly, enough B-24s existed that diverting several squadrons to special operations would not significantly impact strategic bombing campaigns. The aircraft chosen came from an unusual source. Rather than pulling bombers from frontline units, the military selected the 22nd Anti-Submarine Squadron, recently disbanded after the US Navy took over maritime patrol duties. These crews possessed precisely the specialized skills the mission demanded: low-altitude flying experience, advanced navigation training, and familiarity with finding point targets over featureless terrain. The modification process transformed standard B-24 bombers into specialized infiltration platforms. Workers removed the ventral ball turret, creating a 44-inch diameter opening that air crews called the Joe Hole, after the OSS agents, nicknamed Joes, who would parachute through it into occupied territory. They lined this opening with smooth metal to prevent parachute snags and covered it with a hinged plywood door when not in use. A handrail was installed along the right side to help agents and dispatchers maintain balance as they prepared to jump. The bomb bay retained its structural capacity but received specialized British container release equipment capable of dropping cylindrical supply canisters with precisely timed parachute deployment. Flash suppressors were mounted on the machine guns in the top and rear turrets to reduce visible signature during night operations. The waist guns were removed entirely, replaced by blackout curtains to prevent any light from escaping the fuselage. Special window blisters were installed in the pilot and co-pilot positions to improve downward visibility during low-altitude navigation. The most distinctive modification involved paint. Standard olive drab and neutral grey camouflage schemes worked adequately for daylight operations at high altitude, but they appeared as dark silhouettes when illuminated by German searchlights. The solution required covering the entire aircraft, including its massive wings and twin tail, in glossy black paint. This was not the flat black used for night fighters, but a special anti-searchlight paint with reflective properties designed to scatter and absorb light. Over 500 pounds of this paint went onto each aircraft, transforming the already substantial bombers into spectral shadows that could slip through defended airspace with reduced detection probability. Later modifications became more sophisticated. Some aircraft received black paint only on lower surfaces, with olive drab retained on top to reduce visibility from above. Others had specialized radio equipment installed, including the Rebecca system, a radio navigation aid that communicated with ground-based Eureka beacons operated by resistance forces, and S-phones, short-range air-to-ground radios that allowed direct voice communication with reception committees. Waiting at drop zones, the electronic systems represented cutting-edge technology for 1944. The Rebecca Eureka system worked on a principle of radio triangulation. The airborne Rebecca set transmitted a signal that the ground-based Eureka beacon received and retransmitted. The Rebecca equipment then displayed the direction and approximate distance to the beacon, providing navigators with accurate bearing information, even in complete darkness or poor weather. The S-phone operated on different principles. It used ultra-high-frequency radio waves that had limited range but could not be easily intercepted by German direction-finding equipment. This allowed carpetbagger crews to conduct two-way conversations with resistance fighters on the ground, confirming identities through code phrases before releasing supplies. The sophistication of these systems highlighted how far electronic warfare had evolved since the war's beginning, when radio navigation consisted primarily of direction-finding loops and dead reckoning. In January 1944, the newly designated 801st Provisional Bomb Group began operations from RAF Tempsford, an established base for British Special Operations flights. The first American carpetbagger mission departed on January 4, 1944. Inaugurating what would become one of the war's most sustained clandestine air campaigns. The learning curve proved steep. American crews, despite their anti-submarine experience, had to master techniques that contradicted everything they had learned about bomber operations. Standard doctrine emphasized formation flying, mutual defensive fire, and operations at altitudes above effective anti-aircraft fire. Carpetbagger missions demanded the opposite: solo flights, radio silence, and altitudes between 400 and 600 feet above terrain. At these heights, the B-24's characteristic instability in slow flight became a constant challenge. The aircraft's stall speed approached 130 miles per hour. Supply drops required reducing speed to near-stall conditions to minimize opening shock on parachutes and reduce the risk of container damage. Pilots had to maintain precise control while flying by moonlight over unfamiliar terrain, watching for high-tension wires, church spires, and terrain features that could appear suddenly in the darkness. Navigation posed extraordinary challenges. The carpetbaggers flew without benefit of radio navigation aids for most of their routes. German forces monitored all radio frequencies, and any electronic emission could reveal the aircraft's position and alert night fighters. Navigators relied on celestial navigation, using the stars for position fixing when weather permitted, and dead reckoning, calculating position based on airspeed, heading, and elapsed time. Over the blacked-out European landscape, where no city lights or vehicle headlights provided reference points, they looked for terrain features visible in moonlight. Rivers reflecting the moon's glow, forests appearing as dark patches, and occasionally the geometric patterns of agricultural fields. The missions were scheduled around the lunar cycle, concentrated in the week before and after full moon, when ambient light provided maximum visibility. During the new moon period, operations ceased entirely. The moon became as critical to mission planning as fuel capacity or enemy fighter activity. RAF Harrington became the permanent home for carpetbagger operations in April 1944. Located in Northamptonshire, It was the westernmost and highest elevation 8th Air Force Station, providing marginal advantages in avoiding German radar coverage during departure and return. The base itself became a closed facility with security measures far exceeding normal bomber stations. Personnel were carefully screened. Movement on and off the base was restricted. The black-painted B-24s were dispersed around the perimeter in hard standings positioned to minimize their visibility from outside the fence line. Even within the base, information compartmentalization was strictly enforced. Ground crews who maintained the aircraft knew nothing about their missions. Loaders who placed supply containers in bomb bays did not know what the containers held or where they would be dropped. Packers who assembled the containers were kept separate from personnel who determined drop coordinates. The operations staff who planned missions received instructions directly from OSS headquarters in London through secure communications channels, bypassing normal chain-of-command structures. The cargo carried by carpetbagger aircraft reflected the diverse needs of resistance operations. Standard loads included weapons, primarily British Sten submachine guns and American M1 carbines, chosen for their relatively lightweight and simple operation. Ammunition came in calibers compatible with both Allied drops and captured German weapons. Explosives arrived in various forms: plastic explosive charges for sabotage, time delay fuses for coordinating attacks, and incendiary devices for destroying fuel depots and transportation infrastructure. Communications equipment formed a critical component: radio transceivers that allowed resistance groups to coordinate with Allied headquarters, batteries to power the radios, spare parts, and codebooks for encrypted communications. Medical supplies ranged from morphine and sulfur drugs to surgical instruments and field dressings. Personal items included clothing, particularly boots, which were difficult to obtain in occupied territory, and food items that could sustain operatives working in remote areas. Some containers held more specialized equipment. Printing supplies allowed resistance groups to produce counterfeit documents and propaganda materials. Currency, carefully aged to avoid suspicion, financed operations and paid informants. False identification papers, ration cards, and travel permits helped agents and operatives move through German checkpoints. Occasionally, loads included items that seemed mundane but proved invaluable. Bicycles, folded and secured in special containers, provided silent, inconspicuous transportation. Pigeons, carried in specially designed Quaker tubular containers with 3 days of food and message capsules, served as backup communication links when radio contact failed. Some containers held escape kits for downed Allied airmen. Civilian clothes, maps printed on silk handkerchiefs, concentrated food tablets, and compasses disguised as buttons. The variety of cargo reflected the OSS's understanding that supporting resistance operations required more than weapons. It demanded addressing every practical need of people conducting clandestine warfare behind enemy lines. The human cargo carried by carpetbagger aircraft proved equally diverse. OSS agents trained in specialized schools in England and the United States parachuted into occupied territory to organize resistance activities, conduct sabotage operations, and gather intelligence. Jedburgh teams, 3-man units consisting of an American or British officer, a French officer, and a radio operator, dropped to coordinate resistance actions with Allied military operations. Special operations executive agents working for British intelligence used American aircraft to reach their assigned areas. Some passengers were returning resistance leaders who had traveled to England for coordination meetings. Others were technical specialists, explosives experts, wireless operators, or personnel trained in organizing guerrilla forces. The process of dropping human cargo required careful coordination. Agents wore special padded jumpsuits to protect against injury during the parachute opening shock. They jumped from the Joe hole, stepping into darkness at altitudes between 400 and 600 feet, giving their parachutes barely enough time to deploy before reaching the ground. Dispatchers, specially trained crew members, managed the drop process, ensuring agents exited at the correct moment and in the proper sequence when multiple jumpers were aboard. The reception process on the ground followed carefully choreographed procedures. Resistance groups received instructions through coded messages broadcast by the BBC. A seemingly innocuous phrase, "The giraffe has a long neck," or "Grandmother's birthday is Tuesday," meant a drop was scheduled for a specific location. Resistance members would travel to the designated drop zone, often a remote field or clearing, and wait for the aircraft. The standard signal consisted of 3 high-powered flashlights, arranged in a line with a fourth positioned at a 90-degree angle, indicating wind direction for the drop. When the aircraft approached, reception committee members would activate the flashlights, or if flashlights were unavailable, small signal fires arranged in the same pattern. The S-phone allowed verbal confirmation of identity. The pilot or dispatcher would ask a pre-arranged question, and the ground contact would respond with the correct code phrase. Only after this authentication would the crew release their cargo. The containers descended on colored parachutes, with different colors indicating different types of contents. Red parachutes typically marked weapons containers, while other colors denoted explosives, supplies, or personal equipment. The operational tempo increased dramatically as D-Day approached. In January 1944, the 801st flew 15 missions. By April, as the group relocated to Harrington and expanded by absorbing additional squadrons, operations accelerated rapidly. May 1944 saw the tempo increase further as the Allied High Command pushed to maximize weapons and supplies, reaching resistance groups before the invasion. June 1944, the month of the Normandy landings, represented the peak of carpetbagger intensity. July 1944 recorded the highest single-month total, 397 missions carrying 4,680 containers, 2,909 packages, and 62 agents dropped behind enemy lines. The expansion required additional aircraft and crews. In August 1944, the group absorbed the designation of the 492nd Bombardment Group, a regular bombing unit that had suffered catastrophic losses in daylight operations and was being disbanded. The 492nd had lost over 50 aircraft in 89 days of operations, making it the only 8th Air Force bomb group to be disbanded due to combat casualties. Its remaining personnel and surviving aircraft were absorbed into the Carpetbagger Force, and the 801st officially became the 492nd Bomb Group, though it continued its clandestine mission rather than returning to daylight bombing. Charles Wilson and the crew of the Worrybird joined this intensifying campaign on March 25, 1944. The aircraft they flew, originally named Screamin' Mimi, during its service with the 565th Bomb Squadron. 389th Bomb Group had been modified for carpetbagger operations in February 1944 and renamed. The choice of name reflected the perpetual anxiety that accompanied these missions. The crew knew they flew alone, without fighter escort, deep into enemy territory. They knew German night fighters prowled the darkness, equipped with radar and trained to intercept lone bombers. They knew anti-aircraft batteries surrounded every major city and transportation hub. Most of all, they knew they flew at altitudes that left no margin for error. A mechanical failure, a navigation mistake, or a momentary loss of situational awareness could send them into the ground before they realized anything was wrong. Between March 25 and April 28, 1944, the Worrybird completed 5 successful carpetbagger missions. The crew developed the practiced efficiency that comes from repeated exposure to danger. They learned to read the French landscape in moonlight, identifying landmarks and navigating to drop zones with increasing precision. They perfected the coordination required for successful drops, the pilot maintaining exact airspeed and altitude, the navigator providing precise timing marks, the bombardier managing container releases, the dispatcher calling out distances and confirming parachute deployments. They experienced the peculiar satisfaction of completing a mission, watching containers disappear into darkness, knowing resistance fighters below would soon have the weapons and supplies they desperately needed. The mission assigned for the night of April 28, 1944, carried the designation Operation Lackey 3A. The target drop zone bore the code name Timbale, located near the village of Saint-Cyr-de-Valoges in the Loire department of occupied France, west of Lyon. The area had seen increasing resistance activity as Maquis groups, the rural guerrilla fighters of the French resistance, organized in the hills and forests of central France. These groups needed weapons for the sabotage campaign that would precede and support the Allied invasion. The Worrybird would carry those weapons. The mission profile followed the standard pattern. Take off from Harrington after dark, cross the English Channel at 6,000 feet to avoid light anti-aircraft fire, descend to low altitude over France, navigate by dead reckoning and celestial observation to the drop zone, authenticate with the reception committee, release cargo, and return to England. Weather forecasts indicated acceptable conditions, with sufficient moonlight for navigation and drop operations. First Lieutenant Charles W. Ambrose commanded the aircraft that night. The 24-year-old pilot from Pennsylvania had trained extensively in B-24 operations before transitioning to carpetbagger missions. He understood the Liberator's handling characteristics, particularly its tendency toward instability at slow speeds and its requirement for constant attention to trim and power settings. Flying at 400 feet above terrain in darkness demanded complete concentration. The cockpit instruments provided limited information. The artificial horizon showed pitch and bank attitude. The altimeter displayed height above sea level, requiring constant mental calculation to determine actual clearance above varying terrain. The airspeed indicator warned of approaching stall conditions, but these instruments only told part of the story. Real situational awareness came from looking outside, maintaining a mental picture of the terrain, watching for visual references, and trusting instincts developed through experience. Second Lieutenant Ernest Asbury served as co-pilot, managing power settings, monitoring engine instruments, and providing backup awareness during low-altitude flying. Second Lieutenant Floyd Olson navigated, tracking position, calculating drift corrections for wind, and providing heading changes to reach the drop zone. Second Lieutenant Donald Linehaus manned the bombardier's position, operating the modified release system for supply containers. Staff Sergeant Wilson, the flight engineer, monitored the 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines, watching cylinder head temperatures, oil pressures, fuel consumption, and the countless details that kept the engines running reliably hour after hour. Additional crew members managed radio equipment, though radios remained silent during most of the mission, operated the remote turrets, and prepared containers for release. The Worry Bird departed Harrington and set course for France. The Channel crossing proceeded normally. Over the French coast, Ambrose brought the aircraft down to low altitude, beginning the dangerous phase of the mission. Navigation over the darkened landscape required intense concentration. Villages appeared as dark clusters, barely distinguishable from forests. Rivers caught moonlight, providing reliable references. Roads sometimes showed as slightly lighter lines crossing darker fields. The crew flew southwest, deeper into France toward the drop zone coordinates. Time passed in focused silence, each crew member performing their assigned tasks, trusting their colleagues to perform theirs. The intercom carried only essential communications, navigation corrections, engine status reports, altitude call-outs. As they approached the target area, Olson provided increasingly frequent heading changes, steering them toward the coordinates where the Timbala Reception Committee should be waiting. The terrain became more challenging. The Loire department features hills and valleys, not the dramatic mountains of eastern France, but enough elevation change to create hazards for low-altitude flying in darkness. Ambrose would have been watching for terrain features, comparing what he saw with what the map suggested, maintaining constant awareness of the aircraft's position relative to the ground. The crew began looking for the signal lights that would mark the drop zone. In the darkness below, resistance fighters would be watching the sky, listening for engine noise, ready to activate their lights when they heard the Liberator approaching. What happened in the next moments would be reconstructed later from wreckage analysis and witness statements from French civilians. The Worry Bird struck a hilltop near Saint-Cyr-de-Valorges. The impact occurred at night, suggesting the crew either misidentified their altitude above terrain, encountered unexpected higher ground, or suffered a mechanical malfunction that caused rapid altitude loss. The aircraft was traveling at near stall speed, as required for drop operations, which meant minimal kinetic energy and reduced structural loading, but also meant the crew had minimal margin for maneuvering. When the B-24 hit the hill, it broke into 4 main sections, the catastrophic structural failure testimony to the forces involved in the impact. Fire erupted immediately, likely from ruptured fuel tanks igniting on contact with hot engine components or impact-generated sparks. 5 crew members died in the crash. Lieutenant Charles Ambrose, the pilot who had successfully completed 5 previous missions, Lieutenant Ernest Asbury, the co-pilot, Lieutenant Floyd Olson, the navigator, Lieutenant Donald Linehaus, the bombardier, Staff Sergeant Charles Wilson, the flight engineer. Their bodies were found amid the wreckage by local French civilians who recognized the black paint and special modifications as belonging to the American aircraft that supplied resistance forces. The French gathered the remains and conducted burial with respect, due to airmen who had died trying to arm France's secret army. The local priest performed services. Resistance members who had been waiting at the nearby drop zone attended, understanding that these Americans had given their lives for French liberation. Other crew members, possibly including tail gunner or radio operator, may have survived the initial impact and been captured or evaded. though records remain incomplete on this detail. The missing aircrew report filed after the Worrybird failed to return provides clinical documentation of the loss. It records the aircraft serial number, crew names, mission designation, and last known position. It notes that the aircraft was overdue and presumed lost. It includes whatever information could be gathered from other aircraft in the area that night. Though as carpetbagger missions flew individually rather than in formation, there were likely no eyewitnesses to the actual crash. The report entered the classified filing system maintained for sensitive operations. The families of the crew members received notification that their loved ones were missing in action, later updated to killed in action when confirmation arrived, but the notifications provided no details about the nature of the mission. The families learned their sons, brothers and husbands had died in air operations over occupied Europe. They did not learn about Operation Carpetbagger, about the black-painted aircraft flying alone in darkness, about the OSS, about supply drops to resistance forces. The mission remained classified, one of thousands of secrets that would remain locked away for decades. The loss of the Worrybird was neither the first nor the last carpetbagger aircraft shot down or crashed during operations. 25 B-24 Liberators assigned to the 801st 492nd Bomb Group were lost to enemy action or accidents during the course of the war. 8 more returned so badly damaged they were scrapped rather than repaired. These losses represented a casualty rate that, while lower than some regular bombing groups, was still substantial, considering the specialized nature of the operations and the limited number of aircraft involved. Each loss meant not just the destruction of an aircraft, but the deaths of highly trained specialists whose skills were difficult to replace. Carpetbagger crews required months of training in low-altitude navigation, night flying, and drop procedures. The OSS could not simply transfer pilots from regular bomb groups and expect immediate proficiency. Every loss set back operational capacity at a time when resistance groups desperately needed more supplies, not fewer. Some carpetbagger losses became legendary within the small community of airmen who flew these missions. The aircraft nicknamed Worrybird was not the only bomber bearing that name to crash. A B-17 Flying Fortress, with the same nickname, flew with the 95th Bomb Group and survived the war, creating occasional confusion in historical records. The carpetbagger B-24, known as Br'er Rabbit, successfully dropped the VIS team during the night of June 1, 1944, contributing to resistance operations around D-Day. Other aircraft had names that reflected the dark humor common among men facing death regularly. Playmate, Sad Sack, Misfits. The naming of aircraft served psychological functions. It personalized machines that were otherwise impersonal tools of war. It created identity and esprit de corps within crews. It provided something tangible to remember when aircraft and crews failed to return. The operational security surrounding carpetbagger missions meant that many losses went unrecorded in public memory. Families could not discuss their losses openly because they had no information to share. Veterans could not talk about their service because it remained classified. Local populations in occupied France who witnessed crashes or helped bury crew members understood that discretion was essential. Speaking openly about resistance activities or Allied supply operations could bring German reprisals. The result was a historical silence that persisted long after the war ended. While the strategic bombing campaign against Germany produced extensive documentation, media coverage, and public awareness, the carpetbagger operations remained obscure. The crews who flew these missions became invisible participants in the war's outcome, their contributions known only to a handful of OSS officers and the resistance fighters they supplied. Declassification began in the 1980s, decades after the war ended. Surviving veterans, now elderly, could finally discuss their service. Families of men who had died could finally learn the true nature of their sacrifice. Historians could finally research and document these operations. The process revealed the extraordinary scope of Operation Carpetbagger. Between January 1944 and the end of the war in Europe, the 801st 492nd Bomb Group flew over 2,200 sorties into occupied territory. They delivered approximately 4,500 tons of supplies in containers and packages. They dropped hundreds of agents, including Jedburgh teams, OSS operatives, and SOE personnel. They evacuated dozens of downed Allied airmen and escaped prisoners of war. They conducted leaflet drops, psychological operations, and electronic warfare missions. The carpetbaggers became, in effect, the air arm of the OSS, providing the logistical infrastructure that made large-scale resistance operations possible. The impact of these operations on the broader war effort remains subject to historical debate. Some analysts argue that resistance activities, while psychologically important, had limited material impact on German military capabilities. They point out that even with increased supplies, resistance groups could not stand against regular German forces in open combat. Others argue that resistance operations provided crucial intelligence, tied down German forces that might otherwise have reinforced fronts, and created chaos in rear areas that complicated German logistics and communications. The truth likely lies between these extremes. Resistance activities, supported by carpetbagger supply drops, contributed meaningfully but not decisively to Allied victory. They provided intelligence that improved Allied planning. They conducted sabotage that disrupted German transportation networks at critical moments. They assisted downed Allied airmen, helping them evade capture and return to England. Most importantly, they demonstrated to occupied populations that the Allies had not forgotten them, maintaining morale and hope during years of oppression. The French resistance activities in the Loire region, where the Warrybird crashed, illustrate this contribution. Maquis groups supplied by carpetbagger drops conducted sabotage against railroad lines, disrupting German troop movements. They attacked isolated German garrisons, forcing the Germans to dedicate forces to rear area security. They provided intelligence on German units and defences, information that reached Allied headquarters through the radio networks supplied by OSS drops. When Allied forces advanced into central France in late summer 1944, they encountered German resistance weakened by months of attrition from these guerrilla operations. The weapons dropped by the Warrybird and dozens of other carpetbagger aircraft armed the men and women who conducted this campaign. The radios allowed them to coordinate their actions with Allied strategy. The explosives enabled sabotage that would have been impossible with only improvised weapons. After the war, the citizens of Saint-Cyr-de-Vallorges erected a monument at the crash site. The monument features a stone brick construction with an inlaid black plaque surmounted by a stone star with a black cross. The plaque bears an inscription in French that translates to, "In memory of 5 American airmen found dead under the debris of their aircraft, shot down in flames at this place, April 28, 1944, whose mission was the parachuting of arms to our secret army for the liberation of France and the restoration of our ideal." The monument stands in a clearing at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by a white fence. Local residents maintain the site, ensuring it remains clean and respected. On anniversaries of the crash and on commemorative days honoring Allied veterans, French citizens gather at the monument to remember the Americans who died trying to help liberate their country. The commander of the Warrybird, Lieutenant Charles Ambrose, posthumously received special recognition from the French. The citizens of Saint-Cyr-de-Vallorges made him an official member of the resistance, an honorary French citizen, and named the town square after him. These honors, bestowed after the mission was declassified, represent the French understanding that carpetbagger crews were not merely delivering supplies. They were partners in resistance, taking extraordinary risks to support people fighting for their freedom. The fact that Ambrose and his crew died before completing their mission, before successfully dropping their cargo, did not diminish their sacrifice. They had attempted the mission. They had flown into occupied France. They had accepted the risks. That they died in the attempt made them martyrs to the cause of liberation, as surely as any resistance fighter killed in action against the occupation. Staff Sergeant Charles Wilson's family, like the families of thousands of other airmen killed in World War II, carried their grief privately for decades without fully understanding the nature of his mission. His parents received a Purple Heart, a few photographs, and 6 official letters from the War Department spanning 15 years. Because carpetbagger operations were classified as secret for over 50 years, they grieved without knowing the magnitude of his contribution. They knew he had died in air operations over France. They did not know about the black-painted aircraft, the OSS, the resistance supply drops, or the specialized nature of his service. His sister and brother aged and died without full knowledge of his final mission. When declassification finally came in the 1980s, most of the crew's immediate family members had already passed away. The stories came too late for the people who needed them most, the parents who wanted to understand why their son had died, the siblings who wanted to honor their brother's service, the extended family who wanted to feel pride in his contribution. This experience was common among carpetbagger families. The classification meant that even veterans organizations sometimes struggled to recognize their service. Some veterans encountered difficulties joining the veterans of foreign wars because the secret nature of their missions meant they had no documentation of combat operations. They could not produce mission reports, unit citations, or other paperwork that validated their participation in combat operations. They had participated in some of the most dangerous flying of the war, conducting individual missions over occupied territory without fighter escort, flying at altitudes that left no margin for error, facing both enemy action and the inherent dangers of night navigation over unfamiliar terrain. But because the missions were classified, they had no way to prove their service. Some gave up trying to explain, finding it easier to remain silent than to face skepticism from veterans of more conventional operations. Others persisted, establishing informal networks of fellow carpetbaggers who understood and could validate each other's experiences. The carpetbagger aircraft modifications represented significant engineering challenges. Converting a B-24 from daylight precision bomber to clandestine night infiltration platform required solving problems that had no existing solutions. The Joe Hole installation demanded structural modifications that maintained the aircraft's integrity while creating a large opening in the fuselage. Engineers had to ensure the modification did not compromise the airframe's strength during the high-stress maneuvers of low-altitude flying. The smooth metal lining prevented parachute snags, but had to be installed without creating sharp edges or protrusions that could catch equipment. The hinged plywood door covering the hole needed to seal reliably during flight, while remaining easy to open when needed for drops. Crew members reported that even with these precautions, the Joe Hole created turbulence in the fuselage during flight, particularly when open. Dispatchers pushing containers through the opening or preparing agents for jumps had to brace themselves against the buffeting airflow. The radio modifications proved equally complex. The Rebecca Eureka system required antenna installations that did not interfere with the aircraft's aerodynamics while providing reliable signal reception. The S-phone installation needed careful integration with existing communication equipment, allowing crews to switch between different radio systems without confusion during critical phases of missions. The additional equipment added weight, requiring calculations to ensure the aircraft remained within loading limits with full fuel and cargo. Electrical systems needed upgrades to power the additional radios without overloading generators. Wiring runs had to be routed carefully through the fuselage to avoid interference with cargo, handling and to protect against damage from moving containers or personnel. The glossy black paint created unexpected challenges. Standard camouflage paint was flat to reduce visibility by minimizing reflections. The anti-searchlight paint was glossy by design, using reflective properties to scatter light rather than absorb it. But glossy paint showed every imperfection. Scratches, dents, and wear became highly visible. Ground crews had to inspect and touch up paint regularly, a time-consuming process on an aircraft as large as a B-24. The paint also affected aircraft performance. The thick coating added weight, though not enough to significantly impact mission profiles. More importantly, the smooth, glossy surface altered airflow characteristics slightly, requiring pilots to compensate with minor adjustments to trim settings. These effects were small but noticeable to pilots familiar with standard B-24 handling. The navigation equipment available to carpetbagger crews represented the state of the art for 1944 but would appear primitive by later standards. Navigators used dead reckoning, calculating position by tracking airspeed, heading, time, and estimated wind drift. Over the featureless ocean or cloud-covered terrain, this method could accumulate significant errors. A 10-degree heading error maintained for an hour could place the aircraft miles from its intended position. Wind direction and velocity changes, common over Europe's varied terrain, created additional uncertainty. Navigators compensated by using celestial navigation when possible, taking sextant sightings of stars and calculating position based on the angle between the star and the horizon. This method provided accurate fixes, but required clear skies and stable flight conditions. The violent maneuvering of low-altitude flying made sextant readings difficult. Cloud cover made them impossible. Navigators learned to combine multiple techniques, using celestial fixes when available to correct accumulated dead reckoning errors, then returning to dead reckoning during periods when celestial navigation was impractical. The human factor in these operations cannot be overstated. Every carpetbagger mission required sustained excellence from every crew member over missions lasting 4 to 8 hours. Pilots maintained precise control while flying at altitudes that left seconds to react to unexpected obstacles. Navigators calculated positions using limited information, while the aircraft bounced through turbulence. Bombardiers operated release systems while watching for ground signals and coordinating timing with navigators. Radio operators monitored multiple frequencies while maintaining strict radio silence except for critical communications. Gunners watched for night fighters, while knowing their weapons were nearly useless against modern aircraft equipped with radar and closing at hundreds of miles per hour. Dispatchers managed human and material cargo while working near an open hole in a pressurized fuselage, flying 400 feet above enemy territory. The stress accumulated mission after mission, night after night, as crews flew into darkness knowing many would not return. Sleep deprivation compounded the stress. Carpetbagger missions flew during the nights around full moon, when ambient light provided maximum visibility. This meant operations concentrated in intense periods separated by darker periods when missions were impossible. During operational periods, crews might fly consecutive nights with minimal rest between missions. The briefings before each mission provided new coordinates, new drop zones, new code phrases for authentication. Crews had to absorb this information, file flight plans, conduct pre-flight inspections, and prepare aircraft while dealing with accumulated fatigue. After missions, even successful ones that encountered no enemy action, the adrenaline and tension left crews exhausted, but often unable to sleep immediately. They would return to Harrington as dawn approached, conduct debriefings while events remained fresh, eat breakfast while their minds replayed the mission's critical moments, and finally reach their bunks as daylight flooded the English countryside. The psychological impact of flying alone deserves particular attention. American bomber doctrine emphasized formation, flying for mutual protection and psychological support. Crews could look out and see other aircraft, knowing they were not alone, drawing strength from the presence of fellow airmen facing the same dangers. Carpetbagger crews had no such comfort. They departed individually, flew individually, and returned individually. Over occupied France in darkness, they were utterly alone. If German night fighters found them, no other aircraft would provide covering fire. If they encountered mechanical problems, no wingman could assess damage or provide escort home. If they were shot down, no one would witness their fate or confirm their position. This isolation created unique psychological pressures. Some crew members found the independence liberating, preferring to rely on their own skills rather than maintaining formation positions. Others found it terrifying, the darkness and solitude amplifying every sound, every instrument fluctuation, every moment of uncertainty. The German response to carpetbagger operations evolved as they recognized the scope and importance of these missions. Initially, German forces treated individual low-flying bombers as isolated incidents, possibly lost aircraft or reconnaissance missions. As resistance activities intensified and captured resistance members revealed the extent of Allied supply drops, German intelligence began to understand the systematic nature of these operations. They deployed additional night fighter units to intercept supply aircraft. They positioned anti-aircraft batteries around known drop zones. They infiltrated resistance networks to learn drop schedules and locations. They established radio direction finding networks to detect Rebecca transmissions and S-phone communications. German security forces conducted sweeps after reported drops, attempting to capture supply containers before resistance members could recover them. The cat-and-mouse game intensified throughout 1944 as both sides adapted tactics. Some German night fighter pilots became specialists in hunting supply aircraft. They learned to patrol likely routes to suspected resistance areas. They positioned themselves near known drop zones during full moon periods. They used airborne radar to detect low-flying aircraft that might otherwise remain invisible against dark terrain. The advantage belonged overwhelmingly to the fighter. A German night fighter like the Messerschmitt Bf-110 or Junkers Ju-88 carried forward-firing cannons and machine guns specifically designed for destroying bombers. They had speed advantages over the slow-flying supply aircraft. They operated in their own airspace, knowing the terrain and able to respond to ground controller directions. A single burst from their cannons could destroy a B-24, particularly one flying at low altitude with no room to maneuver. Carpetbagger crews had limited defense options. Their turret gunners might spot an attacking fighter and fire back, but scoring hits on a fast-moving, maneuvering fighter in darkness was unlikely. The best defense was invisibility, flying low enough to avoid radar detection, maintaining radio silence, minimizing any light or electronic emission that could reveal position. The expansion of carpetbagger operations to other theaters demonstrated the universal need for this capability. While the 801st 492nd Bomb Group operated from England into Western Europe, similar operations began in the Mediterranean theatre. The 885th Bomb Squadron, initially based in North Africa and later in Italy, conducted carpetbagger missions into southern France, Italy, Yugoslavia, and other Balkan countries. These missions faced different challenges. The mountainous terrain of southern Europe created severe hazards for low-altitude night flying. Weather patterns in the Mediterranean, with frequent storms and unpredictable wind conditions, complicated navigation. German and Italian forces in these regions, though perhaps less concentrated than in Western Europe, remained dangerous. The 885th flew shorter distances than their English-based counterparts, but often into more difficult terrain and weather. Operations into Yugoslavia illustrated the complexity of supporting resistance forces in regions with multiple competing factions. Yugoslav partisans fighting German occupation were divided between communist forces led by Josip Broz Tito and royalist Chetniks, who sometimes collaborated with Axis forces against the communists. Allied policy eventually favored Tito's partisans as more effective against German forces, but this meant carpetbagger crews delivered weapons to communist guerrillas, who would later establish Yugoslavia's post-war communist regime. The political implications of these operations went beyond simple supply missions. The weapons and equipment dropped by American aircraft directly influenced the post-war political landscape of Eastern Europe. The crews flying these missions rarely understood these broader implications. They received coordinates, flew to drop zones, released supplies, and returned. The geopolitical consequences of arming particular resistance factions became apparent only years later. The technical challenges of drop operations required innovative solutions. Standard military supply containers were too heavy for individual parachutes when fully loaded with weapons and ammunition. British designers developed specialized containers designated as Type C, cylindrical metal canisters approximately 5 feet long and 15 inches in diameter, divided into 5 cells that could hold different types of cargo. The containers attached to specially designed parachutes using quick-release mechanisms that allowed ground crews to rapidly separate the parachute for reuse or concealment. Containers were color-coded by parachute color to help reception committees identify contents without opening them. Red typically indicated weapons, green indicated explosives, blue indicated supplies, white indicated food or personal items. The system worked efficiently when reception committees were organized and the drop was accurate. Less successful drops resulted in containers scattered over wide areas, some landing in trees or bodies of water, others breaking open on impact with loss of contents. Package drops presented different challenges. Items too small or oddly shaped to fit containers were wrapped in padding and attached to individual parachutes. These packages might contain radio equipment, medical supplies, or personal items requested by specific agents. They were more difficult to drop accurately than containers, particularly in wind. A strong crosswind could carry a lightweight package hundreds of yards from the intended drop zone. Ground crews learned to watch container drops first, observing wind drift, then adjust positions before activating signal lights for package drops. Even with these precautions, some packages were never recovered, landing in inaccessible locations or being found by German patrols before resistance members could retrieve them. The human drop procedures through the Joe hole required extraordinary courage from the agents being dropped. They would sit in the fuselage during the flight to the drop zone, wearing bulky padded jumpsuits, heavy boots, and parachutes that added substantial weight and bulk. As the aircraft approached the drop zone, they would move forward to the Joe hole and position themselves on the edge, legs dangling through the opening, the slipstream pulling at their bodies. The dispatcher would hold them by the shoulders or harness, preventing premature exit. When the drop light turned green, the dispatcher would release them or tap their shoulder, and they would push off into darkness, falling through 400 feet of night air before their parachute deployed. The opening shock at such low altitude was severe, often causing bruising even with padded suits. They had seconds between parachute opening and ground impact, barely enough time to check their canopy and prepare for landing. Some agents broke bones on landing. Others landed in trees, becoming tangled in their parachutes and requiring assistance from reception committees to get down. A few landed in water or on rocky ground with fatal results. The evacuation missions conducted by carpetbagger aircraft highlighted another dimension of their operations. After D-Day, as Allied forces advanced through France, increasing numbers of downed Allied airmen and escaped prisoners of war gathered in areas controlled by resistance forces. The OSS organized operations to extract these personnel rather than attempting to infiltrate them back through enemy lines to Spain or Switzerland, the traditional escape routes. Modified B-24s landed at crudely prepared fields in liberated areas, loaded passengers, and returned to England. These pickup operations, while less frequent than supply drops, saved hundreds of Allied personnel who might otherwise have spent months evading capture or been recaptured before reaching safety. The missions were extraordinarily dangerous. Landing a large, heavy aircraft on an improvised field required exceptional skill. The fields were often short, poorly marked, and surrounded by obstacles. German forces sometimes learned of planned pickups and positioned forces to attack landing aircraft. Pilots had to approach in darkness, land without normal runway lighting, load passengers quickly, and take off again before German reaction forces arrived. One such mission, Operation Townsend, occurred in southern France after the Allied invasion of that region. A B-24 landed at an improvised strip near the Swiss border, loaded 34 passengers, including downed airmen and escaped prisoners, and successfully returned to Italy despite German attempts to intercept the aircraft. The passengers included men who had been evading capture for months, living rough in forests and mountains, sustained by French civilians who risked their lives to shelter them. They emerged from hiding thin, exhausted, and often sick, but alive and free thanks to carpetbagger operations. For these men, the black-painted B-24 that landed in a French field represented the difference between eventual liberation and recapture, between survival and death in a prisoner of war camp, or execution as spies if caught in civilian clothing. The strategic deception aspects of carpetbagger operations deserve recognition. German intelligence devoted substantial resources to tracking Allied supply operations, attempting to predict invasion timing and location based on where supplies were being dropped. Allied planners used this German focus to conduct deception operations. They ordered supply drops to areas where no invasion was planned, creating the impression that resistance forces were being built up in those regions. They dropped dummy parachutists, devices that simulated the sound of small arms fire when they landed, in areas distant from actual operations to confuse German intelligence about Allied intentions. These deception operations succeeded partially because German intelligence believed the Allies would heavily support resistance forces in areas targeted for invasion. By dropping supplies widely across France and other occupied territories, the Allies made it impossible for German forces to determine which concentration of resistance activity indicated genuine invasion preparation versus deception. The post-war fate of carpetbagger aircraft varied. Most surviving B-24s were scrapped in the Great Demobilization following victory in Europe. The United States found itself with thousands of aircraft, far more than needed for peacetime forces or foreseeable future conflicts. The B-24s, despite their prodigious service during the war, were considered obsolete. Newer aircraft designs offered better performance, and the B-24's reputation for difficult handling made it unpopular among peacetime crews. Most aircraft were flown to collection points, stripped of useful equipment, and cut up for scrap metal. Their aluminum returned to civilian economy, transformed into household goods, automobile parts, and other peacetime products. A handful survived as museum pieces or flew briefly in civilian service. The specialized carpetbagger modifications made these aircraft particularly unsuitable for preservation. The black paint, the Joe hole, the special radio equipment all marked them as specialized military equipment inappropriate for civilian use. The personnel who flew carpetbagger missions returned to civilian life carrying their classified experiences. They faced questions from family and friends about their war service but could not answer honestly. They attended veterans gatherings and remained silent when others discussed their missions. They knew they had participated in important operations but could not explain why. Some found the transition to peacetime more difficult because they could not process their wartime experiences through discussion. Psychologists have documented the importance of narrative in processing trauma and stress. Veterans need to tell their stories, to share their experiences, to place their wartime actions in context through conversation with people who understand. Carpetbagger veterans were denied this outlet. The classification made their experiences literally unspeakable. They carried memories of night flying over occupied territory, of watching containers disappear into darkness, of friends who failed to return, of the peculiar anxiety that came with flying alone into enemy territory, knowing no help existed if things went wrong. They carried these memories alone, in silence, for decades. The families of men killed in carpetbagger operations faced similar challenges. They grieved without understanding, mourned without knowledge. The military provided minimal information, citing classification. Families received personal effects, sometimes photographs found in lockers or letters written but not yet mailed. They attended memorial services and accepted folded flags, but they did not receive the narrative that gives meaning to sacrifice. They could not know that their son or brother or husband had died supporting resistance forces, arming people, fighting for freedom, conducting operations that contributed to liberation. This knowledge gap created a particular form of suffering. The families knew their loved one had died in military service but could not explain why or how except in the most general terms. As time passed and memories faded, the details became increasingly sparse. By the time declassification occurred decades later, many families had given up seeking information, accepting that they would never fully understand their relatives' final mission. The French population in areas where carpetbagger operations occurred maintained living memories of these missions, even when official records remained classified. Villages where aircraft crashed erected monuments without official permission or recognition. Resistance members who had participated in reception operations told their children and grandchildren about the black American bombers that brought weapons in the night. Local historians documented crash sites and attempted to identify crew members. These grassroots preservation efforts kept memories alive in France, while official silence prevailed in the United States and Britain. The disconnect created situations where French villagers knew more about American operations than American families whose relatives had participated. French researchers attempting to document local resistance history would contact American military archives seeking information about specific missions or aircraft, only to be told the information remained classified. The situation reversed after declassification, when American researchers could finally access official records and share them with French communities that had preserved crash sites for decades. The technological legacy of carpetbagger operations influenced post-war military development. The techniques developed for low-altitude night infiltration missions became doctrinal for special operations aviation. The radio navigation systems evolved into more sophisticated electronic aids. The procedures for authenticating ground contacts and coordinating air-ground operations directly influenced modern special operations tactics. The organizational structures created to integrate intelligence agencies with military aviation became models for post-war cooperation between the CIA and military special operations forces. The painted aircraft that prowled darkness over occupied Europe in 1944 were ancestors of the specialized aircraft that would conduct similar missions in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts. The basic mission profile, delivering personnel and supplies to irregular forces operating behind enemy lines, remained constant across decades despite dramatic advances in technology. The human cost of these operations deserves final accounting. 25 B-24 Liberators lost meant well over 200 crew members killed, missing, or captured. Each loss represented not just the destruction of an aircraft, but the end of young lives, the creation of widows and orphans, the imposition of grief on families. The missions they flew, while important, were not the massive strategic operations that captured public attention and historical focus. They were small-scale, clandestine, conducted in darkness and silence. The men who flew them were not celebrated in the press or honored in public ceremonies during the war. They flew and sometimes died anonymously, their missions unacknowledged, their sacrifices unrecognized. This anonymity continued for decades. Unlike the crews who bombed Berlin or participated in major raids, carpetbagger veterans could not share their experiences or claim recognition for their service. The nature of their operations, the classification that surrounded them, made them invisible participants in events that shaped history. The revelation of carpetbagger operations through declassification created opportunities for recognition but also highlighted how many participants had died without acknowledgement. Veterans who survived the war lived through decades when their service could not be discussed. Many died before declassification, taking their experiences to graves unmarked by any recognition of the extraordinary missions they had flown. Their widows and children learned the truth too late to ask questions, too late to express pride, too late to understand fully what their husband or father had done. The French communities that preserved crash sites and honored fallen crew members did so without official support or recognition, maintaining memories through local effort and determination. When official recognition finally came, it validated these grassroots preservation efforts but could not restore the decades of silence or return the lost opportunities for veterans and families to share experiences and memories. The Warrybird and its crew exemplify this larger story. They flew 5 successful missions, delivering weapons and supplies to French resistance forces. They prepared for their 6th mission, knowing the risks, accepting the dangers, committed to their role in the war effort. They took off into darkness, flew across the Channel, descended to low altitude over occupied France, and navigated toward their drop zone. Something went wrong. Whether they encountered enemy action, suffered mechanical failure, or made a navigation error, the result was the same. The aircraft struck a hill, broke apart, burst into flames. 5 crew members died instantly or shortly after impact. The mission failed. The supplies never reached the waiting resistance members. But the attempt itself, the willingness to fly that mission, represented the same courage and commitment that characterize successful missions. The French recognized this, honoring the crew as members of the resistance, naming a town square after the pilot, maintaining the crash site as a memorial. They understood that the men who died there had come to France to help liberate it, that they had volunteered for dangerous missions, that they represented American commitment to ending Nazi occupation. Staff Sergeant Charles Wilson's final moments remain unknown. Whether he died instantly in the impact, or survived briefly in the burning wreckage, or maintained consciousness long enough to understand his fate, the record does not reveal. What is known is that he volunteered for military service, trained as a flight engineer, mastered the complex systems that kept B-24 engines running reliably, accepted assignment to classified operations, and flew repeatedly into occupied territory on missions whose importance he understood even if he could not discuss them. He was 23 years old when he died. He left family who mourned him without understanding the full nature of his service. He left crew members who survived him, if any did, carrying memories of a friend and colleague lost in darkness over France. He left behind the aircraft he had maintained, now wreckage scattered across a French hillside. His legacy rests in the monument erected by French villagers, in the historical record now declassified and available for research, and in the broader story of Operation Carpetbagger, which armed resistance forces and contributed to the liberation of Europe. The black-painted B-24 Liberators of Operation Carpetbagger flew more than 2,000 missions into occupied territory. They delivered thousands of tons of weapons, ammunition, explosives, radio equipment, medical supplies, and personal items to resistance forces. They dropped hundreds of agents who organized, coordinated, and led guerrilla operations against German occupation forces. They evacuated Allied personnel from behind enemy lines, returning them to operational service. They conducted these missions at night, alone, without fighter escort, flying at altitudes that left no margin for error. 25 aircraft were lost. Well over 200 crew members died or were captured. Their operations remained classified for decades, rendering their sacrifices invisible to the public they served. The declassification that began in the 1980s revealed this hidden history, allowing veterans to finally discuss their service, enabling families to understand their losses, permitting historians to document and analyze these operations. The story of the Warrybird and its crew represents thousands of similar stories, most lost to time, many involving men whose families never learned the truth about their final missions. It represents the intersection of courage and technology, individual sacrifice and strategic necessity. It illustrates how wars are fought not only in the dramatic battles that capture historical attention, but in countless smaller operations, classified missions, and secret campaigns that remain unknown until decades after the fighting ends. The men who flew these missions were not extraordinary individuals. They were ordinary Americans who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances, who accepted extraordinary risks, who performed their duties with skill and courage. Some survived and returned home carrying classified secrets they could not share. Others died in darkness over foreign landscapes, their sacrifices unacknowledged, their missions unexplained. The recognition that eventually came through French monuments Declassified records and historical research provides a measure of justice for these forgotten warriors. It allows their stories to be told, their contributions to be acknowledged, their sacrifices to be honored. But it cannot restore what was lost, the decades of silence, the opportunities for veterans to share experiences and families to understand losses. The price of secrecy, paid by those who served in classified operations, extended far beyond the immediate dangers of combat. It included years of carrying experiences that could not be discussed, of attending memorial services where the truth could not be spoken, of answering questions about military service with vague responses that betrayed nothing of the reality. The men who flew carpetbagger missions paid this price willingly, understanding that operational security demanded silence. Their families paid it unknowingly, grieving without understanding, mourning without context. The legacy of Operation Carpetbagger extends beyond the specific missions flown and the supplies delivered. It established precedents for cooperation between intelligence agencies and military aviation. It proved that heavy bombers could conduct precision infiltration missions despite being designed for strategic bombing. It demonstrated that technological innovation, from specialized paint to electronic navigation aids, could create capabilities that doctrine had not anticipated. It showed that individual courage and skill could overcome tremendous obstacles when organizational structures supported unconventional operations. Most importantly, it illustrated that wars involve countless hidden campaigns, secret operations, and classified missions that contribute to victory, even though they remain unknown to the public. The black-painted B-24s that prowled European nights in 1944 were instruments of this hidden war, flown by men whose courage deserves recognition, even though decades passed before their stories could be told. In the end, the story of the Warrybird is not primarily about an aircraft or a mission. It is about the 5 men who died in a French field on April 28, 1944, trying to deliver weapons to resistance fighters. It is about the families who grieved without understanding. It is about the French villagers who honored foreign airmen killed trying to help liberate their country. It is about the veterans who survived but could not speak about their experiences. It is about the decades of silence that surrounded these operations, and the eventual revelation that allowed the truth to emerge. Most of all, it is about the cost of war, measured not only in casualties and destruction, but in secrets kept, stories untold, and recognition delayed until after those who earned it had mostly passed away. The monuments that stand at crash sites across France, maintained by local citizens who remember, serve as testament to sacrifices that nearly vanished from history, preserved by the memories of people who witnessed events they could not discuss openly but refused to forget entirely. The monuments that stand at crash sites across France, maintained by local citizens who remember, serve as testament to sacrifices that nearly vanished from history, preserved by the memories of people who witnessed events they could not discuss openly but refused to forget entirely.